implementation proceed with caution. I'm Nate Herman, Vice President of International Trade at the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Representing 350 member companies and more than 1,000 named brands, AFA is the National Trade Association representing the apparel, footwear, and accessories industry, as well as the supplier community, which all compete in the global marketplace. AAFA is the advocate and political voice of the apparel and footwear industry. And as with today's webinar program, education, training, tools, and resources are a mainstay of how AFA represents the industry. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to review a few technical notes. If you're having trouble listening through your computer speakers, please dial in using your telephone. The number is located in the audio section of your control panel, which is on the right side of your screen. If you're unable to join or having difficulty accessing the webinar, please go to webinar support directly at 855-352-9003. All participants will be muted on today's call. If you have a question, please type it in the question box on your control panel. We will try to address all questions during the presentation, but if we can't get to them all, we will follow up via email. We have a great program lined up today, so let's get started. Today's speakers are Gary Baracco, Robert Kaufman, and Cheryl Lane. As Vice President of Industry Development for ecVision, now called Amber Road, Gary Baracco is responsible for developing strategic product marketing direction and presenting the Amber Road brand and solutions worldwide. He also works closely with industry-focused organizations and cross-functional service providers to establish relationships that enhance Amber Road solutions to benefit its customers. He leads the marketing, communications, and execution team to support sales operations in the United States and abroad. Robert Kaufman, CEO of the Parker Avery Group, has spent the last 20-plus years leading clients through the design and implementation of key supply chain processes and system initiatives. He is a skilled project manager who specializes in product lifecycle management, sourcing, inventory management, and logistics. And finally, we have Cheryl Lane, who's the VP of Customer Success for ecVision, now called Amber Road. Cheryl is responsible for the product development strategy and execution of new products and solutions supporting industry demands and trends. Cheryl manages the product delivery and account management teams in the United States and Asia, ensuring the success of every client implementation. Now, please join me in welcoming our first presenter, Gary Baracco.
Thanks, Nate, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and we thank you for joining. Nate and the team over at AFA ecVision, now Amber Road, it continues to be impressed with the turnout that we have, providing more meaningful content and education. You know, we met up with Robert Kaufman from Parker Avery Group last year, and one of the things that impressed us most was Robert's deep expertise working in the apparel and footwear industry for many years. I think on our next slide we have some bios about not just the company, but ecVision, I'll talk about first, has recently been acquired by Amber Road. We are a cloud-based software supply chain collaboration platform, and the software that we provide is modular-based and spans everything from design to receipt into the warehouse. And now with our new footprint of being an Amber Road division, we can take that even further into global trade management. And Robert's team, Robert's company that he started, really as a consulting firm, works with some of the leading brands and retailers to develop and enhance strategies. Next slide when you get there, Rachel. Thanks. Before we start on this, I wanted to talk quickly about how we set up our relationship with Parker Avery Group and Robert. Robert published an article that really struck home for us, and It's all about out-of-the-box software solutions and how to deploy. And Cheryl, who's beside me now, is responsible for implementing all of our customer software implementations. So the three of us got together, and we decided that we would talk further about how to implement out-of-the-box solutions and give you some tips and tricks and some real-world examples. Thanks again for joining us. Robert, you there?
I am. Thank you, Gary. I appreciate that, and welcome to everyone. I appreciate your time spending with us this next hour or so. So as Gary said, I published an article around out-of-the-box solutions, and one of the premises of the article and what we're going to talk about today is the evolution of solutions in the retail marketplace and where they are today, and what is meant by out-of-the-box and how companies can leverage that type of a solution into their organization. So a bit of history, if you refer to the slide. 15, 20, 25 years ago, most companies, retailers, had very custom-developed, tailored solutions. They were really built within the IT organization themselves. And they were highly customized, very costly, and took a lot of time to implement. Over the years, companies started to realize that was really not a sustainable model. So the marketplace started to change, and software packages became much more popular. However, the early software package had similar characteristics in that they were highly customized. This too led to high implementation and support costs. Eventually, the solutions did become more adaptable through configuration options, but even then, the myriad of options that software companies were offering did lead to long and costly implementations, if not governed closely. Probably in the past 5 or so years, solution providers got wise and began to create what has become known as out-of-the-box offerings or solutions. And these were heralded as being quicker paths to benefit. And that's true, but while these out-of-the-box solutions are an improvement, one might be led to believe that you simply buy it, plug it in, and off you go. Well, it's perhaps not quite that easy, and this has led to some confusion and perhaps some false expectations about what it means when a company's buying or agreeing to take on an out-of-the-box solution from a software provider. So with that as the backdrop of the evolution, we're now going to talk a bit about what out-of-the-box means and kind of compare that to some of the other definitions in the marketplace.
Right. So we're going to, one of the things that Cheryl and I talked about was how our prospects and customers are constantly saying, well, does that come out of the box? And there's, everybody has their own definition of what out of the box. I remember when software used to really come in a box. And so I think that's, we often harken back to those early days where it came out of the box literally, and I could just stick the disk into my computer and get it to run or load it up. And nowadays, as a hosted or SaaS model, that really isn't the case. But we still need to be cautious when we talk about how the product comes when it's packaged. So Cheryl, talk about how we define at ecVision what is out of the box. Let's look at these 3 definitions actually and say configured, pre-configured, and customized.
Right. So I agree with Robert in that there has been definitely a transition to these out-of-the-box solutions, and we've seen that a lot over the past year. So, defining, what those differences are is always a challenge, and sometimes customers have, a different thought process as to, what the definition is. But, combined together, this is our thoughts as to what those definitions are. So for configured software, that's basically being able to use UI features, to do different selections, and to use what's actually in a base out-of-the-box system with little effort and actually no effort, and just being able to have different configuration changes. Pre-configured, on the other hand, is a system that is put together, and this is the most normal definition of out of the box, that you have an industry-specific, out-of-the-box, pre-configured solution that has all of the bells and whistles that are needed for, let's say, a footwear industry or the apparel industry. And so that has become what the definition for out-of-the-box is, that all of those things are delivered. So with customized then takes it to the next level, which is everything is, well, not everything, but there are certain aspects and certain gaps that certain customers have that require that the base code actually be changed, which in there comes the definition of customized. So that is actually base code changed for a specific customer so that we are meeting that customer-specific needs. This comes up a lot, and that's the challenge. As you can see there, that the traditional large-scale implementation is often perceived lengthy, expensive, resource-intensive because there's a lot of gap. Each customer feels that there are a lot of gaps, that how they're doing things is the way that it needs to be done for them. And so I think one of the things that, that we'll get into a little bit more is that this out-of-the-box solution that's pre-configured for an industry is an accelerator to the implementation process that will actually reduce the time, the cost, and it'll speed up the realization of value.
Well, and one of the things, Cheryl, that Robert talked about was in the last kind of icon on the first slide was that we set the wrong expectations. So as software sales organizations, we let our prospects know that, oh, well, this comes out of the box, and so it's going to be really cheap and easy for you to implement. When in actuality, when we look at the processes, and we're going to talk about internal process change and what that requires to fit into one of these three, let's say, buckets of implementation, can you live with something or without it? But as long as we're not making a guarantee that, or making some false promises and setting those false expectations. I think when Robert, as a consultant, works with an organization and they say, well, this company just sold us this software, but it's not exactly what they said. Is that the case that you run into, Robert, and really what stemmed that?
Yes, it's kind of a shades of gray, if you will, in that it's question of what is it really going to take to implement the solution, and what additional effort and or configurations or customizations are going to be required to take the solution set that is pre-configured or out of the box to really deliver the results and the benefits that the customer or our client is really looking for.
Right. Okay. Right. So let's talk further. Let's look at the next slide, Rachel, and see how much further down the road we're going to go. One of the things we wanted to talk about was there are opportunities for out-of-the-box solutions to work for you, and so what does it take then for an out-of-the-box solution to fit? Are there certain business areas? Does the size of your company matter? So, Rob, you want to start that conversation?
Sure. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, so as Gary said, it's not to say that there aren't scenarios where an out-of-the-box solution can really fit without much, if any, additional work. But as you'll see as we discuss this, many of these scenarios are not going to apply to some of the companies that you guys probably work with. One is if you're a new startup or a smaller, less complex company with basic processes and, as it says, more adaptive mindsets, meaning that you're willing to live with, I don't want to say rudimentary capabilities, but more basic capabilities that would apply to everybody within that solution set. So if it's a footwear-specific solution set, you would be, agreeing that your capability set is going to be common with all the others and taking a little bit less capability. And that may be a viable scenario, but in most cases, companies who are more well-established and more complex aren't going to fit that bill as well.
Right. So, Robert, I think one example would be is if they're a small company and just using Excel to manage their business, right? Those types of organizations are very key to being able to take an out-of-the-box solution and, systematize that, correct?
Sure, exactly.
I love some of the terminology, though, that's on this slide. When, I just jumping out at me, adaptive mindset, willing to limit, committed to altering. These are things that, really come important when we're working together with a consulting group and an organization to deliver a solution that will work for you, not just initially, but for long term. And I think all of these characteristics are important from the IT and the business side to take into consideration. And that's the tough part, because
right.
People say, well, I can't live without that.
Right. So, Robert, as you, talk to various companies, and it's something that I see that, everyone's original goal is always to try to go with out of the box, right? And then once we start to dig in and understand the organization and their needs, then, as consultants, it is our job to, give a little pushback and, really dig into why do you do these things. That's a common question for me as well. Why is it that way? Do you have that same, situation as you talk to clients as well?
Absolutely. During the selection process, nary a person will say that they're not going to commit to an out-of-the-box kind of vanilla solution. And they're all saying the right things, and I think at that moment maybe they truly believe it. But the devil's in the details, and once you get more into the design of the solution and what it's really going to mean to their organization, people are pretty protective of the sacred cows of how they do things today, and also they want to optimize their part of the process. There's very few parts of the organization that are willing to take a more holistic view and say what's best for the whole organization is something I'm going to sign our team up for. And so what happens is there's a bit of a land grab for capabilities, and that means that that out-of-the-box solution ends up being insufficient to really meet the needs of given organizations. And without really strong leadership and governance, that goal at the outset of trying to have a vanilla or out-of-the-box solution really goes by the wayside in my experience.
Right. And one of our bullets here is that, as customers are looking for an out-of-the-box solution, really, if it doesn't meet 70% of your needs, then maybe that's not the, solution for you for an out-of-the-box, correct?
Yes, I would agree. If it's less than that, it's probably, I don't want to say the wrong solution, but you're signing up for a great deal of additional work around configuration and customization. But that's really, I think, the end point here, and you said it earlier, Cheryl. Out of the box, if it doesn't fit kind of the upper 3 points here, where it is still a huge advantage is that it's an accelerator. It's rather than starting from scratch and sitting down with these highly configurable solutions and software vendors and saying, well, what would you like? It's a bit more prescriptive, but it's based on best practices of what the software companies have seen, and then use that as an accelerator to get to a place that delivers value more quickly and with less money. Right.
I think that's a main initiative, I think, for most companies as they're doing the selection process.
All right. So, Rachel, this will take us to the next slide, and we'll broaden the topic a little more. So, there are reasons why we would want to extend beyond out of the box, and we've listed some of them here. So we'll start with Robert's commentary on these areas where we think that it's going to be worth the money for us to customize or configure.
Sure, thanks, Gary. I alluded to earlier talking about sacred cows, meaning that an organization may want to keep their way of doing things simply because they've always done it that way. But what we try to do is challenge them to think differently and to say, well, why can't we leverage what is a best practice? Where that often can't be supported with an out-of-the-box is where there's something that's truly unique, a true differentiator, what we're calling here the secret sauce for the company. And for those things, it makes a lot of sense. You don't want generalize the solution set to lose that differentiation. And some examples that I've encountered are a company I worked with recently. Their product structure was, for fashion companies, it wasn't style, color, size. They weren't exclusively a soft goods company, and their hard goods products, not only were they four-dimensional, but they weren't using the same structure for every product category. So different product categories had different product attributes and structure. So it was important, in fact, imperative that we had to support their product structure. So we had to extend the capabilities of that base solution as an example. One other is, some companies that I've worked with have a desire to have what I call a progressive purchase order, which over time, you put some general information into the solution up front about quantity and style, but over time you get down to more specificity about size, pack configuration, how much needs to go to which distribution center and what time frame, and then that purchase order sort of evolves. And it allowed one particular client I worked with to be more trend reactive so that they didn't have to commit on the PO at the outset, but could start to provide that information later, and was an important differentiator for them.
Right. We've seen that as well, that there's definitely some big things that are really unique to certain companies that you have to. There's no way to change, that structure, and being able to find, add-on capabilities to the base solution to support that, is most definitely a must-have. And as people are evaluating, solutions, how difficult is that to make, those kind of changes? And will this, actually work with my current systems the way that they're already set up? Because I think one of the things to consider as well is, if they are, most customers, everyone usually has, their back-end ERP, most have a PDM system, so it's, things that are already ingratiated into the entire process that need to be accommodated then for any, supply chain backside, to that information as well.
I think one of the bullets on here that, well, there's two that jump out the most to me, and that's the what if and analytical capabilities. Supplier scorecarding has always been really important, but now I think there's so many different types of points of measure for our suppliers, and trying to get all of that right. What are the proper weights? And we're even talking to Robert about doing another webinar that talks about supplier management and scorecarding in particular, to see how to get that, what's the right mix, what's the right equation for that. But then the adoption piece comes in.
Right.
Usability is so important, and ensuring that you can buy and implement software solutions, but if it's not embraced and used, it becomes shelfware.
Right.
And we never want any of our solutions or solutions that Robert implements to be handled that way, only because it's too sticky or kludgy.
Right. Nothing will stop a rollout quicker than the usability factor. And I've seen it time and time again. If change management wasn't, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but if you haven't engaged, the users at the beginning, the usability, when you roll it out, they will just, put a halt to it, and everybody will regroup, and everybody will figure out, how to get that adoption rate then back up. Robert, have you seen those types of implementation scenarios on your side as well?
Absolutely. I mean, succinctly said, you could have the greatest mousetrap, but if it's harder to use than how they work today, they're gonna really resist and are not going to go forward with it. Things as simple as freeze frames of the panes on a screen. Not being able to do that, making it really cumbersome to see the data on a screen. I've seen that be a huge issue in solutions that can do that, or actually enhancing the solutions to do that don't, really made a huge difference in usability and ultimately the adoption of the solution.
Right. Yep.
So, okay, Rachel, let's advance now and look. I think we're going to talk about configuration beyond out of the box and where this really fits. So Cheryl, you want to talk about some real world experiences here on where we've seen, going beyond out of the box fits best.
Right, right. I mean, there's certain things that, everybody does the same, right? But then there are, 3 things that we thought were key to being different for almost every single company that we deal with. So costing. Everybody does costing differently, right? Some people do it at the BOM level, some people do it at first cost, some people do it at FOB. So there are many, many different ways to do costing. So coming up with an out-of-the-box solution for apparel and footwear customers that is, generic is very difficult. Everybody does their landed cost calculations differently. We can have the components, but how that gets calculated is different, and all of the calculations, right, from what do they take into account when they are calculating their IMUs. Are they different based on whether it's a retail, a wholesale, a raw material, a finished good? So, each one of those things adds to some complexity, and being able to do those type of things out of the box has become more and more challenging. So I think, just one of the conversations to have when you're evaluating someone is, okay, do they understand that, or are they coming with just, no, this is how we do costing and this is all it can be. So, when they have the ability to have more configuration and have more of a UI to make changes, that is more of an issue there. So, I mean, Robert, are you seeing that with costing, and then how does that also funnel then into the production tracking?
Yes, absolutely. Costing is, as you said, Cheryl, one of the the great challenges of making sure that it really addresses every client's needs. And then, talking about production tracking, here too, everybody, there's clearly some best practice around which events, ought to be looked at, but every company is going to have a little bit different viewpoint on that. Some want to look at more events, if you will, along the supply chain than others, and then understanding when to let somebody know if something is out of tolerance. What are those tolerances? Do I tell somebody when it's out of tolerance, as it's approaching being out of tolerance? Who do I notify? All of those things are configurable and make sense to be configurable and lend themselves to being, extensions beyond an out-of-the-box solution.
Right. I mean, I've had customers that have as few as 10 tasks that they want to track all the way up to 120. So coming up with, any normalcy to that is very challenging. But you're right. I mean, there are key things. Have the goods shipped? Has the inspection been completed? There's some normal things, but then there's each customer puts their own twist on, exactly how they're doing the tracking. Then with the supplier management, this is also something that is, it is all over the place, where, supplier dashboards are great, and there are some basic ones, but even within the basic dashboards, you get into, well, what is the formula that drives that? So you can have just as, an on-time delivery report, right, for all of your vendors, and you understand this is when I needed it shipped, this is when it was supposed to arrive, and this is when it did arrive. But that seems very simple until you start diving into, well, did I change the purchase order? Did I say that they could ship later? Did I tell them they needed to ship earlier and they couldn't meet that date? So in all fairness to all parties, you have to look at all of those scenarios in order to come up with a viable supplier dashboard that makes sense. So coming up with ones that are out of the box are quite easy to do, but then making them up to date and customer specific for how they actually would want to see their information is something that does fall outside of the box.
So moving on to the next slide, we go to the converse and we say, well, okay, we've now decided to extend beyond out of the box, and now we've got some pitfalls when we customize too much. So Robert, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, the important thing here is that there may be some viable reasons to customize a solution. Some of the things that Cheryl and I just alluded to, depending on the software, may not be able to be done through configuration and may require customization. The challenge is balancing the amount or number of customizations versus the performance of providing business benefit. So in other words, you need to make sure that you've got a governance process in place to ensure that the customizations don't just run amok, because as you increase the customizations, there's work that's required to actually build those. So implementation costs go up. There may be some difficulty actually upgrading depending on how that solution incorporates customizations or how different from the base architecture it is. So then your support costs could go up. And ultimately, because of the additional costs and the longer duration it takes, the realization of benefits take a lot longer. So those are all things to be wary of. Again, not to say that you couldn't and shouldn't ever do a customization. It's really just balancing it with the benefit and having a rigorous review and analysis process to make sure that everybody understands what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the implication of that decision.
Right. I think it's, one of the items that, if I was, looking at a solution, I would ask these questions, right? If I need to, customize on top of the out-of-the-box, is the code sitting on top of the framework? Is it embedded in the framework? And really start asking a lot about the architecture and how that works so that you understand what those pitfalls are. And then, I think some of the other things with the higher implementation costs and the longer duration, one of the things that we see as well is those are certain things that can't be avoided. But, one thing is to look at to have a phased-in approach, right? So maybe phase in the, out of the box first, and then, use that for a little bit of time and do a gap analysis based on the out of the box, and then, add things on as are needed as must-haves. And, it's always good, at least in my experience, always good to get the users something quicker than later, and having that phased-in approach, because they get so excited, and you don't want to lose that momentum. So you don't want a lengthy timeline. So breaking it out into multiple phases really is a best-case scenario for everyone when it comes to these types of implementations.
And I think upgrade path is really important too. So as a cloud-based solution, and if we roll out new versions, how does all that customization then limit what the customer can enjoy without having to do more customization to fit their platform?
Right. Upgrades are always at the top of the list and should always be discussed, up front.
All right. So our next slide are the do's and don'ts. So it's a toss-up. I think Robert's going to start with the do's.
Yeah.
I get to be the positive one, sure.
Yeah. I don't know. Somehow I drew short straw here. I don't know how that is, but I'll do the don'ts. That's fine.
Okay. Well, some of these hopefully are obvious, but if not, I mean, you want to have strong and visible executive sponsorship. And any project success is really tied to how engaged senior leadership is and how much they champion the effort, because there are inevitably going to be challenges along the way. And having strong leadership, whether it is to keep you on the path of minimal customizations, or it's around the change process and people realizing that their jobs are going to change and that they have to buy into that. Without that executive support and championing, things can go awry. So that's an extremely important do. We talked about letting go of the sacred cows, and really that's about embracing best practice. Now, if your sacred cow is a best practice, I'm not suggesting you let go of those, but it's really those things that you do because you've always done it rather than because they are best practice or a true differentiator. We talked a bit about the governance for customizations. We just touched on why that's really important. And creating a collaborative environment for everyone where folks have an opportunity to have their input heard. I'm not suggesting it's a full democracy, but you need to engage everybody. People need to understand that they're part of the change process, and that's all part of the change management effort. And engaging folks and making sure that there's bidirectional input. They get input and they get communication back as to what's happening, why it's happening, and when it's happening. And if you can do those things, you're gonna be down the path to great success. Cheryl, you get to look at the negative viewpoint.
I get to put the damper on things. No, I think the don'ts actually become very positives, right? So a couple ways to spin that, right? So don't forget about the end users in all of the phases, right? So sometimes organizations let other people drive the requirements as opposed to all of the end users. And that ends up going back to that adoption, right? So by including the end users through every process, starting with just the, even the selection process, through the requirements, through the development, through the gap analysis, all of that, because they, in the end, if it doesn't get adopted by the end users, you do not have a successful implementation. So, just keeping them engaged the entire time. And then the next one is don't minimize the amount of communication needed with all parties. Over-communicate. Keep everyone in the loop. I cannot stress that enough because nothing is worse than, you get to the end of the project and people are like, oh, I didn't even know that was happening, and oh, we have a big event that month, and there's no way we can do what you need us to do for testing and things like that. So please, 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 always over-communicate. Don't shortcut on your testing and rollout plan. I have seen customers very aggressively going in with a testing and rollout plan only to have to stop halfway through because they did not allot enough time. There was too much change management that needed to be dealt with that hadn't been dealt with. And so it's, okay, stop, reevaluate, come up with some other documentation, and then we'll roll out again. But, I mean, that can put, a 2-month delay into any implementation if that is the case. So always ensure that you have enough time for testing and enough time for rollout. Training 800 vendors in a month is pretty aggressive, right? So it's like, okay, let's come up with a plan that, makes sense, that will get everybody's buy-in and it will be successful. And then the last one is don't over-engineer a solution to fit your current processes. Again, this gets back to, okay, at minimum, try to utilize, that base 70% of the out-of-the-box. Change some of your processes, if at all possible, and at least reevaluate them. Don't walk into, requirements and just, hand everybody, okay, this is exactly what I have today, and I just need you to build me a system based on this, because I can guarantee you, you will not meet the 70% of that out-of-the-box threshold. So I think one of the other parts of that is the over-engineering part, where customers get very excited to have hard stops and to have everybody doing their piece of the puzzle. And, I think we've all found that by doing that, you're limiting the success as well, because, that change management may not happen as quickly as you want. So try to stick to and implement as few of those issues, of those gaps as you need that would be customized, and play with it, for a couple months. Let everybody get in, go through it, do a big pilot, and then get that feedback. And then if things need over-engineered a little bit, then you have some time to do that. But these are, all key things, to be wary of as you move forward with an implementation.
So, Robert, on the next slide, it gives you the opportunity to make us honest from the software sales perspective. So, what are the steps when selecting and evaluating a software provider that an organization should do?
Sure, and maybe it's one other of the don'ts. It's, don't underestimate that there is work to be done with an out-of-the-box solution. So how do I know what I'm really getting is really what this is asking. So as any of us on the phone who have been part of selections know, there's going to be product demonstrations. But almost always that product demonstration is done by the sales team, pre-sales team, and it's rarely done with the out-of-the-box solution. There's usually a fair amount of tailoring, customization, magic sometimes that happens during the sales process.
Yes, I hear magic a lot, Robert. That's a key implementation word.
Exactly. So, what I have encouraged clients to do is, once you've gotten to a place where you feel like a software vendor is a finalist, ask to see that out-of-the-box solution. Now that may, and I stress may, require some engagement from their implementation team. I would encourage that, because sometimes the transition from the sales team to the implementation team may not be as seamless as you would like. And by engaging the implementation team, albeit it may be at a small cost, a cost that's well worth it in the long run, they can then give you some real insights into what is in that out-of-the-box solution, and sometimes you'll learn some things during that process that you wouldn't otherwise have learned from the sales team.
So that's like a conference room pilot type of thing as opposed to a sales demo?
It's an interesting question. It depends on the depth of that. You could go through a conference room pilot proof of concept, which is one of the things that is a possibility. There's also a lesser involvement where it's just more of a deeper dive with the implementation folks on a for-fee basis for a day or two, but it's scripted and such, but they'll really get into the nuances of what's in that out-of-the-box solution or not.
These are great points.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, contacting the customer references as part of any selection that we're going to do, we're going to strongly encourage this. But if there are, and there hopefully are, customers who have implemented the out-of-the-box solution, hearing from them how that experience went is really important. Not just the time and effort that's required, but sometimes how familiar is the implementation team with the out-of-the-box solution. And you can learn a lot from those customer reference calls, so I would strongly encourage that. Some people find an on-site visit, actually going to that customer, is a good way to do it as well, and watch a day in the life. If you can make that time investment, that's also very valuable. And then lastly is, always a decision you're making when you buy software is the relationship with that vendor. So you really want to have, what I call real-world discussions of what's really required to gauge that authenticity with the sales and pre-sales team, with the implementation team. Look the Garys and the Cheryls in the eyes and make sure that they are giving you the straight scoop, because you can learn a lot about the solution and the solution provider, and you want to feel very comfortable that you have a good cultural alignment and that there's a deep trust there.
Right. It ends up being one of those, relationships that, definitely, I have dear friends that started out as customers. It's long-term. It's years of an investment, and yes, making sure that there's a cultural fit, making sure that, there's no personality clashes, as cliche as that sounds, it is a big deal, because it is a long-term, day in, day out type of relationship. And the key word that you said there was trust. And if you don't have that trust, then the ratio for success for the project is clearly diminished.
Robert, when do you think it's the right time to, when you're doing a product selection, for instance, software selection, when should you bring in like the implementation team, like Cheryl's side of the business, to start collaborating? Because if you do it too early or if you do it too late, there's a balance, I think. So.
Right. Yeah. Usually, once we get down to maybe a couple of finalists, and probably the customer already has in mind who their leading solution provider is, because there's several things that you're going to do at that point. What we just described about learning more about the out-of-the-box, you really want to understand the implementation methodology, the approach. Some companies are a little bit more agile in the literal sense, and some are more waterfall. Because you also want to estimate, what is that deployment going to look like in terms of resources and costs. So you wanted, to your point, Gary, you need to get past the initial hurdles, because you don't want to do this with everybody because it's a time-consuming effort. But once there's a pretty good understanding that this may be the solution provider you're gonna spend the next 10 years or so with on this solution, you really want to engage that implementation team.
Right. I think one of the key things that I have found change over the past 20 years is that it used to be whoever was cheapest got the deal because everything was very customized, right? And now that there's these out-of-the-box solution packages, it's not always money that is the deciding factor. I think all of these other things that we just hit on actually are bigger parts to the selection process than in the past, and that money is not still at that top of the list anymore. Do you find that to be the case, Robert?
Yes, and some of the smaller companies are going to be more driven by cost, but to me, what I've seen more and more is the adoption and the likelihood that the solution that these companies are going to spend upwards of millions of dollars on total cost of ownership, that it's going to be a solution that they have and the users embrace for years upon years. So that the whole process of ensuring that the organization is adopting and institutionalizing that solution, and the processes and organizational alignment that goes with it is really paramount, and that's what drives the ultimate decision.
Yep.
So as we wrap up, we want to talk about, well, where have we gone in our discussion this afternoon, and what's the path forward? So I'll ask each of you to alternate and take a stab. So Cheryl, you're the one that talked about this out of the box as an accelerator. So why, again, does that accelerate?
Right, because it's giving you, we'll use that 70-30 rule. It's giving you 70% of what you need upfront base, and then you're only looking at the diff. So I think, and again, the goal of these out of the box are to shorten the delivery time, lessen the cost, and be more industry specific as opposed to industry agnostic.
And Robert, you stressed a few times about governance.
Right. Just make sure that you don't get too enamored with the flexibility of the solution, such that it could, build the most complex and comprehensive mousetrap, because you will find that you've perhaps over-engineered it, and then you have extensive configurations and customizations, which lead to more time and cost. So just have a really good process in place to evaluate that, and make sure that everyone understands what you're buying into if you decide to go that path.
Even if that means bringing in a third party like you to be the mediator, right?
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Right.
I wouldn't be averse to that. Yes, that's correct.
So part of what he was talking about was the configuration and the customization. So, just very clearly as a customer, understand the differences between those when you're talking solutions with any providers, and to understand exactly what you're signing up for, of what's in the out-of-the-box, what would be considered a configuration, a customization, and again, back to those other slides, what does that mean monetarily, upgradability, and those things. So that's huge for you all to be aware that those are questions you should be asking.
And the last point, Robert?
Yes, we didn't really touch on it overtly, but one of the things that we do a lot with clients is build roadmaps of how the benefits or the capabilities and the solutions are delivered. And we stress that it needs to be paced by the organization's ability to absorb change. And that's a lot of consulting ease. That just means that, retailers have a lot of demands. We all know what's going on in the marketplace and how the consumer is really driving a lot of that change. We need to make sure that the organization can handle the project or projects, and that may mean take a little bit more time, but ultimately, as I've stressed, to do that, it'll increase the adoption. And so, as Cheryl did point out, in so doing, we really do stress and recommend shorter, more pointed deliveries of capabilities, less complex, and then you build momentum. You get that success, you build upon it, and over time, you continue to have short cycle implementations that build on each other and ultimately have a very successful adopted solution.
Okay, great. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Nate, and we'll see if we have any other questions that have come in.
Thanks, Gary and Robert and Cheryl. We will now open the floor to questions. We have a few minutes to take those questions. You guys happen to answer a few at the end there, but we have a few more that have come in. The first one is, it's a question, who would be the person in an organization to be the project manager for implementing a new system? Who would be the ideal person from your perspective on managing the project within a company?
Well, I'll jump in just, and Robert, you can add on to it. From our perspective, there needs to be just someone the project manager needs to be very heavy into project management skills, coordination, and all of that. That's usually someone either from the IT department or someone from the business sponsorship. Most likely it is coming from the IT department to drive all of that, because with every project they're usually integration, but it could come from either source. They just need to have very strong knowledge of what everyone is trying to accomplish, and also really big knowledge in process and process change. Robert?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the challenge is, depending on the complexity of the project or program, we've often seen a lot of project managers and one program manager. For example, you might have somebody who has project responsibility for all change management, and somebody who has project responsibility for all of the technical deliverables or the business process components. And, some of those would be people that are in the business, some would be people in IT. Ultimately, that program manager, to Cheryl's point, needs to be somebody who has real depth of experience in managing multiple work streams and understands kind of the mechanics of it and managing issues and risks and the like. And whether that comes from the business or IT is less important than that you have the right sponsorship and the right folks who have that capability set.
Right. I agree.
Okay. The next question has to do with, you described a situation in general. Would what you described as sort of the optimal way a company should approach implementing a new system, would that apply to any system they would be implementing within their organization? Or is that more focused on if they're implementing a PLM type solution? Or is this something that you could carry into any type of system change?
Well,
go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, I would say that the tenets of what we talked about today would apply to most any type of solution. There might be some nuances with certain areas that, candidly, I might not be as in-depth or experienced in around, an e-com solution or finance and such. But I don't think there's anything that we talked about today that wouldn't apply to any of the functional areas that a retailer would want to implement.
I agree. I agree.
Okay, and then last question, because we're almost out of time here, is Cheryl, in particular, you described the sort of the ideal, the 70-30 concept. In your experience, and Robert, in your experience, is that what companies usually ask for, or are they all over the map, or most want to be heavily customized versus more towards an out-of-the-box?
Right.
What is your experience in reality versus the ideal?
Well, I think, from our perspective, everyone starts with wanting out of the box, right? And they really, truly, as Robert said earlier, they really, truly believe that there might be an opportunity to do that. And I think once, though, they get, familiarized with the process, they sit through, several presentations, and then, they come to the realization that there will be, customizations that need to take place. And past experience over the past few years really has been come very close to a 70-30 rule, and actually has been very good about doing that type of situation.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, and maybe disagree slightly, is as the closer you get to the folks doing the work, the more inclined they are to want to do a customization, because they're the ones who are looking at, what's in it for me, or what is it going to mean for me. And if it means my job's going to be a little bit harder, then clearly I don't want to necessarily take that out-of-the-box solution. As you move up the management ranks and folks perhaps have a more holistic expectation, or are being asked to take a more holistic viewpoint, you'll see more of the out-of-the-box resonating and such. But it's a balance, and that's why, back to the strong management and leadership, to be able to get the whole organization to sign off and be okay with that 70-30 approach is important.
Right.
I think that should wrap it up with our time. What do you think, Nate?
Yeah, I think that was a great way to end off our seminar. I want to thank all the speakers for providing us with such valuable information, and all of our attendees for joining us today. Today's webinar will be recorded and available on the AFA website by the end of the week. All participants will receive a follow-up email containing links to the webinar recording and presentation slide deck. And please don't forget to fill out the webinar survey. That'll be in the email. Additionally, if you submitted a question that we did not have a chance to address during the webinar, your question will be answered via email.
Great.
To learn more about the topics in today's webinar, please visit AAFA at www.weware.org and Amber Road at www.ecVision.com. You can also reach today's speakers via email with any additional questions you might have. Thanks again, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a great day.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Yep, bye-bye.